Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Lech. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, and we're really excited to be joined by our guest today, Nathan Robinson. You know Nathan from the excellent Current Affairs magazine. And Nathan, frankly, it's been way too long. It's a shame it's taken us this long to get you on the program. We're really very happy you're here.
You never invited me up to that. How many episodes have you done? You never invited me.
Well, we'll rectify that now. I think we got a banger here, and this is a pretty broad subject, but an important one. And as folks know, the excellent teacher and comrade, Chomsky is unwell right now, pretty seriously so. And Matt and I want to do something to sort of talk about Chomsky and his legacy and influence on so many of us. And the first person whose name popped into my head was Nathan, because I know Chomsky has been a huge influence on you. So I really appreciate you coming on the program to talk about Chomsky. And I mean, maybe to just set us up, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Chomsky, like, how you came across his work and how it affected you when you first came across it?
Yeah, so I think I was given when I was 14, 15, I had a friend in the high school who was a year above me and who gave me, fairly sure it was Failed States by Chomsky. It's the first I'd seen, and told me I had to read it, that it would, blow my mind and what have you. And I have to say my initial exposure to Chomsky was that I struggled to get through the book because I was not at that point very interested in foreign policy. And I couldn't really understand, I was interested in domestic economics and inequality, and I just didn't, all this stuff about Chile in 1973 did not interest me that much. And so I was a little put off, and I don't know that I made it through the book for a while. And then over the next years, through just exposure to his interviews, oftentimes it was his interviews that I found the most compelling. Just listening to him talk and how kind of sensible and careful and rational he was, how easily he kind of deflated bad ideas, the sharpness of his thinking. And what I came to appreciate and what was so influential on me was, as I say, not exactly the foreign policy analysis, although the book that I'm publishing with him in the fall is a summary of his foreign policy analysis. It was more like the Chomsky method, which was just so calm, so literate, so well researched, right? I mean, all his books are so dense with footnotes, but they're footnotes to reliable sources. You go and you look up anything Chomsky says and you know that he has a source for it. He was just such a careful political thinker and reasoner. And so when I started doing political writing, that really entered my style a lot. I wanted to be able, but he was also scathing, right? So Chomsky has this incredibly dry wit and this withering style. And I feel like anyone who reads my writing these days can probably see where the influence is.
Yeah, it's one thing that's funny about or interesting about Chomsky compared to just a lot of other left-wing writers, let's say, is that Chomsky really is not afraid to use kind of, official government sources or mainstream accounts of things, not in some kind of, fidelity to, that he believes everything that's in the New York Times, but it's somebody who is actively engaging with the world around them versus a lot of folks on the left. I'll just be honest that, you will see not just an echo chamber, but just a kind of refusal to interact with certain kinds of mainstream sources. And I think that's something that I think is really compelling for a lot of people who are interacting with Chomsky who aren't, let's say, 2 feet in on the left wing side.
One of the things about his technique is that he insists that if you read the New York Times, cover to cover, you can find a good part of the truth in there, but you just have to read it carefully. So a lot of his, really harsh critiques of Israeli policy are built out of things he's found in the Israeli newspapers, which he read very carefully. So oftentimes, the governments admit what they're doing. And you just have to kind of look, and you have to know what to look for. And he's very good at selecting, going through And there are so many amazing admissions. And as I was doing this book with him that we just, it was finished a while ago, but it is being published now. There are so many incredible moments where, the most damning evidence is found, on page A15 of the New York Times.
He really is the ultimate facts don't care about your feelings guy. Like, he really, it's a very dispassionate sort of, I just finished The Fateful Triangle, and, all of his books, and, my experience
that's a beast.
was... It is. I got on Audible, so I listened to the audiobook. But my experience was I bought the manufacturing consent because of the was it Good Will Hunting, where they talk about Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and like it was tough for me to get through. It was like actually like communication studies. I should have been into it, but it was just very heady. And then I read Hopes and Prospects. But it's interesting, like, contrasted with Hitchens, who is sort of the other like towering figure of, I think, say guys in their mid-30s, intellectual sort of speakers. Like, Chomsky was always the dispassionate facts guy, and whereas Hitchens was like the personality.
I was just watching a thing he did where he said, you should strive to be a bad speaker. Because if you're a good speaker, then you're like fooling people with like rhetoric, and you're trying to, and he's like, you shouldn't try to persuade people either. You should just, like, he really believes, like, you should just lay out the facts. You shouldn't have drama in your speeches. You shouldn't even really have like structure to them. Like, I remember when I was in college and Chomsky came to speak, and it's just like his speech started and then 90 minutes later it ended. But I was like, well, and he told me a lot of things that I didn't know about, but was there a beginning, middle, and end? Not really. And actually, one of the contributions that I make to this book, The Myth of American Idealism, is that I wanted to kind of give Chomsky a little more structure, a little more of a like beginning, middle, and end, a little more of the thing that he is bit reluctant to do on his own, which is some rhetoric, a little bit of flair. So I think this book has a little bit of flair to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about this book project, folks.
Well, so this is crazy because I mentioned, when I read Chomsky a bit in high school, and then obviously he was a very formative influence on me intellectual, but I didn't know the guy, right? He was just a towering intellectual. He's the most cited intellectual in the Western world or whatever. And then when I started Current Affairs, so in 2015, we started Current Affairs with a crowdfunding campaign. In 2016, I wrote a book about Bill Clinton called Super Predator. And I knew a guy, John Halley, who was the son of one of Chomsky's longtime MIT collaborators. Morris Halley is famous linguistics professor there. And John got my book to Chomsky, and Chomsky really liked the book, and he subscribed to the magazine. So he's been one of our subscribers for years, since the very early days. And he would then he would like email us when his issue didn't show up. And this is crazy, and this is another thing that he's always done, is that he's been really supportive of small left ventures. He gives tons of blurbs to books with little lefty publishers. I was just talking to Doug Henwood, who publishes the Left Business Observer, and when he started that, Chomsky bought a subscription and paid by check, and so he subscribes to and supports a lot of small things. And so I had corresponded with him just a bit, and then I asked him if he'd be interviewed for the magazine, so I flew out to Tucson. I did an interview with him. That was in like 2018. I did another interview with him a few years later, and then at a certain point, I just got real bold, and I was like, hey, could we write something together? Because I knew that he is very open to collaborators. He's co-written a lot of stuff. Manufacturing Consent was co-written with Edward Herman. He's had tons of collaborators. So I thought, well, could we co-write something? So we co-wrote an article on the Afghanistan war for Current Affairs. And I can't remember if it was before or after the article that I asked him if we could just do a book. because I've always wished there was like a one-stop shop like intro to Chomsky that was really good. There's one called Understanding Power that's great, but it's from the early 90s, so it doesn't have anything on the last 30 years. And so it's a little dated, and I just wanted there to be like a summary of the of his critique. So I thought, well, I'm an editor. I'd be really good at like taking his words and helping sort of craft them in a way that was accessible. So this book, which sort of began with me taking everything he'd ever said and working with him to go like, okay, well, is this the important thing about this event that should be said? And is this the important thing about this event? And okay, let's rework it and update it. And it was really, really cool. It wasn't quite done at the time that he had his health event, so I was sort of left with this giant pile of notes that I had to kind of edit. I mean, most of the book was complete. It was very close, but we still had this giant pile of notes. So I've had to kind of, polish it off. But now it's ready for print, and I think it respects what he would ultimately have wanted the exact finished product to be, because I did everything with that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that consideration as somebody who produces a show, we had Chomsky on the old Michael Brooks show, and that was maybe a capstone of that period. And I always felt like maybe we should try to get him on Left Reckoning, but I also wanted to respect his time a little bit. But I do think because frankly, he was doing everybody reaching out to him, and I appreciate that a lot. And I just felt like there's a little bit of a feeding frenzy, but that to compile his work like that and sort of give people the overview, I think is a really valuable endeavor, because there's going to be a lot of young people who weren't in the mid 2000s seeing him as one of the few people who would be mentioned as a genuine left voice.
And he's never, one of the strange things about that I kind of just realized through working with him is he's very, very, very confident. Like he will savage you in a debate, right? If you start arguing, he will savage you. But he's also weirdly humble or modest. Like he disparages his own work in a certain sense. His significance. He's like, oh, it doesn't mean anything to me. And he would never have. The crazy thing is, he's never published. It's not that he's never published a book, because obviously he's published 100 books. But he just oftentimes the books aren't his idea. Like someone will come to him, just like this book, and say wow, you said these incredible things. Can we put them in a book? He had never, when I approached him about this, I said, we've got to do a book proposal to the publisher, right? And he's like, do we? He's like, I've never done a book proposal. He's like, so it never occurred to him to sit down and try to sell a book. That would almost be like an act of arrogance to presume that you had so he's never sat down and go, I have my ideas, I'm going to put my great ideas together in a book. He just kind of says things off the cuff, and other people are like, that's really profound. And he's like, okay, well, if you think it's profound, you can have it. And he would also this democratic thing where he would go on any podcast. I mean, he really when Current Affairs was tiny, he came on our podcast. You see him on YouTube channels with 40 followers.
Mm-hmm. And the email is obviously very, very famous.
Right.
Anyone could write him an email.
The email archive. I swear, I just thought recently that he probably has close to the world record for most emails, substantive emails, not spam emails, but real emails ever sent. Because he started doing this in the very earliest days of email, and then he did it for hours and hours and hours a day, non-stop, until he was 95. So he might have close to the world record for most emails ever sent.
Well, yeah, the meme of him getting anybody responding to any inquiry is that was 2007. That was already out there.
I was just, while we're on the subject of emails, before we start playing some clips and talk a little bit more, about his ideology and work, I have to say, I think one of my favorite, and I would love if y'all had something to share too after this, but one of my favorite Chomsky, at least in recent years, Chomskyism is when he had this horrible, only horrible because of who he was arguing against, debate with Sam Harris via email. I don't know if y'all remember this.
Oh, yeah.
Sam Harris, who we can, everyone who's been watching this since TMBS, Left Reckoning knows, Sam Harris is an extremely dangerous reactionary who loves to present himself as, like, in a lot of ways, he likes to present himself as what Chomsky actually is, like a very rational, principled, philosophical person. And Chomsky just destroyed him with, I think, the simplest line ever, which is that Sam Harris is a religious fanatic who worships the state, which completely upended that debate because Sam Harris, that caused Sam Harris to have a complete breakdown because in just one line, Chomsky just eviscerated Sam Harris's whole political project.
They had a long email exchange. Sam Harris, by the way, I've written an article about Sam Harris, or co-written an article with Eli Massey called "Being Mr. Reasonable," and it's about exactly that, pretending to be reasonable when you're in fact a fanatic. And Sam Harris, his only response, by the way, you can check the Sam Harris Reddit forum where all of his fans were like, did he ever write a response to Robinson? And no, he didn't. What he did was he said, Nathan Robinson is mentally ill, and I know this because of the length at which he's talked about me. Now, I went to length so I could debunk all his arguments, but his response, he didn't. So a rational person would have replied to the arguments, but he didn't reply to the arguments. He replied with, what did he reply with? An ad hominem. Well, there's your rationality there, right? Just like, William Buckley ends up slipping into the ad hominems and threatening to punch you, if you get him. So anyway, the Chomsky Sam Harris email exchange, though, was very interesting because, yes, he waved him away as a worshiper of the state, but the email exchange is about the question of collateral damage versus intentionality. Chomsky has often branded the U.S. as a terrorist state, and Harris is saying, well, how can we be when we mean well? Our victims are by accident, whereas when Osama bin Laden, is trying to kill people, but we just do it out of benevolence, but we wish we didn't have to. And Chomsky points out to him, rather, correctly, that this idea that if you don't kill intentionally, it's morally better, actually doesn't hold up. It sounds superficially persuasive, but Chomsky's like, if you start dropping bombs on a country and you say, I'm not trying to kill the people in it, they're just ants to me. Like, their lives don't mean anything. He's like, that can actually be worse than intentional killing. Because you might intentionally kill someone to accomplish a goal, like you assassinate someone who you believe is, you kill Hitler or whatever. An intentional killing might be done in a way that is more morally justified than a negligent killing. And this point, Sam Harris just could not. He's like, but we're better because we don't do it on purpose.
Yeah, kind of a relevant debate, I think, through the ages, it seems like. Here's a clip of Chomsky, answering a question that I think he's probably answered 10,000 times, about, like, if his approach is for it helps America's enemies, basically.
Are you kicking the U.S. when it's down?
No, I'm asking that we accept the definition of hypocrite given in the Gospels. I think that's correct. The hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. I don't think we should be hypocrites.
To what aim do you do this? To what aim do you wish to point this at?
Because I think we should try to rise to the level of minimal moral integrity. Once we can rise to the level of minimal moral integrity, then we can discuss these issues seriously. If we can't even rise to that level, there's any point to talking. Minimal moral integrity requires that if we think something is wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it.
Really a classic thing, and I just can't help but think about that when I saw somebody say, why can't the global South recognize that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is wrong when America is trying to get a global coalition to that? So, well, it's because we aren't sincere about a lot of these things, and we sort of invoke a principle that we don't hope to live by ourselves, and that has been true since Chomsky was a young guy going on firing line.
Right. I mean, this is really at the core. I mean, this idea that we need to apply the same standards that we apply to others to ourselves, and that I open, you know, in organizing the book. My thinking was, because I was in charge of the organizing, right? They're Chomsky's ideas, and my role is to like figure out where to put them and in what order to try and get people to understand them. So I was like, he deferred to me completely on like, where do we put stuff? And so right up front, I put all the stuff about, you know, let's evaluate if we think, you know, it's wrong to interfere in foreign elections. Well, first we need to ask, do we do this? If we think that the Chinese spy balloon is an affront to us, well, do we examine what we do to China? Do we spy on China, right? If we think that it is aggression for a country to, say, I don't know, station missiles near our border, do we think it is aggression for us to station missiles closer and closer to China or closer and closer to Russia? Are we going to, if we think that Vladimir Putin belongs in The Hague, do we think that George W. Bush belongs in The Hague? And if we don't think this, why don't we think it? And this is such a central point to his analysis. It's interesting that the guy, what's fascinating to me is how many people are like surprised or mystified when Chomsky says like very obvious things. So the guy was like, well, to what end do you point all this out? Like, why? And he's like, well, because, like, I don't know, maybe being like, basically morally decent and consistent, like achieving a minimal standard of normal moral behavior, I think is important.
Yeah, as if you can only evoke morality towards some other end. It's wild that blows people's minds.
To what end?
But I mean, you know, I find this is an interesting thing about Chomsky, though. Even compared, so like obviously with certain kinds of like, you know, mainstream journals or whatever, like, oh, to what end? But also with some people like on the left, like Chomsky gets accused by some very strange folks of being like, to use modern terms, like a tanky, you know, because he'll oppose like American intervention. But he's very reviled actually by some people in those circles as being like too much of like, you know, because he doesn't like support certain kind of dictators or certain moments in history. I'm curious how you would sort of describe, you know, this legacy of his foreign policy, because it's not just like a kind of campism or like a knee-jerk like anti-Americanism too, which I think is a very interesting and understated thing about Chomsky.
This is another thing that I tried to help him bring out in this book, and I don't think people are going to be as confused about this after because a lot of the criticisms are things like, well, why do you talk so much about America? Why don't you talk about, you know, why don't you talk about the atrocities of Iran? Why you're downplaying them? You're downplaying the crimes of the Chinese government. And again, what his response is okay, the criticism that you've made, think about how it would sound if we applied it in other contexts to other countries. So if a Russian dissident author wrote a book or was a speaker criticizing the crimes of the Russian government, would it and the Russian and apologists for the Russian government said, well, why are you talking so much about Russia? Like this, it wouldn't be mysterious. They go, because that's my country. What are you talking about? Why are you talking so much about Russia? Like, why'd you write a book just about the crimes in Russia? But in the United States, for some reason, it's considered, you know, anti-American to focus on your own country, even though, like, if an Iranian did this, if a Chinese dissident did this, Chomsky pointed out Soviet dissidents never talked about American crimes. They talked about Soviet crimes. And so it makes total sense that you would focus on America. There's this other idea that there is, like, some implied excuse for the behavior of other authoritarians. Now, Chomsky is actually an anarchist. So as an anarchist, he's critical of, and he talks about state power, right? He's and concentrated power. So he is just as scathing, actually, about Vladimir Putin as he is about the United States government. Now, it doesn't come out very much because he's more interested in talking about the United States government. But he thinks that Vladimir Putin is a monster and a dictator, and that the invasion of Ukraine is totally unjustified. And weirdly, everyone accused him of justifying the invasion of Ukraine. And no matter how many times he went, no, I'm not justifying it. I'm saying that U.S. policy, that the U.S. expansion of NATO, made the invasion of Ukraine more likely. That doesn't mitigate or justify it. What it means is that if we look at our role in the situation, if we had behaved differently, this would have been less likely to occur. But people see that as, and they see it wrongly as, saying that it was okay for Putin to invade Ukraine. And there are even these, there's a group of 4 Ukrainian economists who wrote this letter, this open letter to Chomsky, where they were like, how can you justify what's happening to our country? And Chomsky wrote a reply, which was published on Counterpunch. You can read the PDF, where he just went through their email and just eviscerated. He's like, none of this is implied by what I said. None of this is implied by what I said. None of this is implied by what I said. And he just demolishes it because it's not true. It's not implied by what he said that it's okay for other governments to commit atrocities.
I must say, on that, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when you watch Chomsky clips, of him talking about something in the 70s or the 80s or the 2000s, right? Because we have, the gift of it being in the past, that you can sort of say, oh, those were the good guys and those were the bad guys. What was interesting about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is all of those same kind of tropes started coming out almost in the exact same way, where you were getting attacked for saying something, again, that's very reasonable, in my opinion, very honest. With all of these kinds of head in the sand thing, well, if you speak out against the U.S., then you support, Putin, and you support this war and all this kind of thing. And it made me, it's both a good thing that Chomsky is still continuing to be consistent in this moment, right? And it's also extremely depressing to just realize, tragedy after tragedy, the same kind of dynamic plays out.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. So he's been writing since Vietnam, and it's okay, unjust war. The enemy is elevated into this monster who's bent on destroy. And if we don't stop them there, Chomsky was writing in the 60s about people saying, if we don't stop Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, he's going to show up in San Francisco next, right? And it was ludicrous, this idea that, if we don't stop them, we're going to fight them there, or we'll have to fight them here. And these same justifications, which is, we don't do things intentionally. We only do things out of, benevolent mistakes. We're trying to help, but we make these terrible blunders and errors. And so he's demolishing all of these in the case of Vietnam, putting all the facts together. Then he does the same thing, in the case of intervention in Central America in the 80s, right? He's excoriating the Reagan administration, which is saying that Nicaragua poses an existential threat to the United States, and invoking national security justifications, and we got to fight the terrorists. Chomsky pointed out when the war on terror was declared by the Bush administration that it was the second time, because Reagan said he was fighting the war on terror when he was when he declared war in Central America, right? He would say, this is the global war on terror, right? So he says the same rhetoric over and over and over and over and over again. And then Iraq comes, the same kinds of things. And so every single war has these similar dynamics where you smear all the critics as unpatriotic, and the only criticisms that are permissible are criticisms that are tactical criticisms, which is, you're not waging the war well enough. Right, those criticisms appear in mainstream media, and as Chomsky points out, give the appearance of a real debate on the war.
Could you talk a little bit about Chomsky's anarchism? I know you mentioned it before, but it is a very interesting aspect of Chomsky's, one of the most well-known scholars in the world, certainly in the U.S. And certainly probably the most famous anarchist, right? Certainly in the contemporary time. And yet, I find that to be a part of his work that I think there's a lot of confusion about, because it seems like it's a very particular tradition to Chomsky. But tell me, tell me your thoughts on that.
I think a lot of anarchists claim that Chomsky's not really an anarchist because he's not... he's okay.
Is it just because he's old school? I mean, literally, he's old enough.
It's because he's a very pragmatic anarchist, right? So he's not radically anti-state. In the sense that he doesn't believe that you shouldn't vote or anything like that. He believes that the government has to do things. He's very, very pragmatic about it. He sees anarchism, as I understand it, as a kind of principle or a suspicion of power. And I think where that kind of leads him to is actually the very thing that people think he doesn't have, which is a serious criticism of a lot of supposedly left-wing states. His analysis of the Cold War is really interesting because essentially he says the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, the United States wasn't capitalist. This is almost entirely an illusion. These are two big, powerful states, both with centralized, concentrated power, and both with a different national myth of what they are pretending to be. So the United States pretends to be this great free market country, but actually, that we're ruled by there's not a free market. There's a very, very small, concentrated ownership. And the Soviet Union pretends to be an egalitarian socialist society, but is nothing of the kind. And so the entire construct of the Cold War as a war between capitalism and communism or capitalism and socialism, Chomsky rejects because he sees supposedly socialist states as violating his principles, often just as much or if not more so than supposedly capitalist states. And so he's very critical of Marxist-Leninism, for instance. And he says that Leninism is almost identical to liberalism, because both Leninists and the liberals believe in a small caste of intellectuals who are the vanguard and make the decisions, and the job of everyone else is just to listen and go along. So his kind of anarchism leads him to interesting places intellectually that are not where some others who consider themselves on the left would go.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to get to, David, but I also have this clip of him talking about Israel-Palestine. And like I said earlier, if people are looking for a book, I mean, The Fateful Triangle, it's long, as Nathan said, but it's Chomsky's method to a T, just like relentless barrage of sort of facts and polemic in a good mix. But here's Chomsky talking about one democratic state with regards to Israel. And this is in Worcester, Mass., I believe, in 2000.
The statement is that, in the course of time, Israel should no longer exist. Well, actually, I happen to agree with that, too. In fact, so do a lot of people in Israel, the ones who think there should be a single democratic state. That's not calling for wiping anyone out. Actually, there are two countries that are not only calling for some nation not to exist, but are destroying it, namely the U.S. and Israel. That's their position with regard to the Palestinians. And they're not just saying it. I stress, they're not just saying it, they're doing it day by day. That's the meaning of the policies that are going on right before our eyes in Gaza and the West Bank, which we are supporting and paying for.
And, I can't help but, I hear in his diminished state, he's still monitoring what's going on in Israel, Palestine. And it's a depressing image. But I do think like the moment we're experiencing now where people have maybe a better ability to elaborate what's going on there owes a lot to his work over the past decades.
Well, an interesting thing that I found also in, assembling all the material that he'd ever done on Israel-Palestine in order to get the raw material for this book was that it's not that he predicted October 7th, but he certainly would not have been at all surprised by October 7th, because one of the themes that comes out in his speeches on Israel-Palestine is he says over and over, he says, Israel could have had security, but it chose expansion. And he says that, he dates it to about, I think, 1971, he says, where he thinks was a crucial missed opportunity. There was a deal on the table with Egypt that Israel rejected. And he says essentially, like, the Israel-Palestine conflict could have been resolved, but Israel made a choice, and that choice is going to perhaps be disastrous, in fact, probably be disastrous for Israel itself in the long run. And he says the people who say they believe in Israel's security don't believe in Israel's security. In fact, they are condemning it to endless warfare. And because the situation that hardline Israelis, far-right Israelis want is to essentially control the Palestinian territory without giving the Palestinians autonomy indefinitely. Well, okay, but that's going to spark resistance. That's inevitable. You just can't hold a population subjugated forever. So there's going to be endless war. There just is going to be. And so this was one of the things that he hammered over and over again was, even as the Trump administration and then the Biden administration were celebrating, the quiet in the Middle East. And I think Jake Sullivan had written this now embarrassing-looking thing in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, where he's like, the Middle East, it's so quiet. Look how much we succeeded. Chomsky would have said, well, this is an illusion because Israel is not secure, because Israel is oppressing a population, and you are going to have a backlash. You are just going to have one sooner or later. And so if you look back over his speeches on this, I think he's very, very prescient.
Well, in the last couple of minutes before we change topics, I want to ask you this as somebody who's been working on this project with him, somebody who's been very influenced by Chomsky. Some of our, we have like younger audience members who might not have really had much experience with Chomsky a few years later. If a young person who reaches out to you and says, hey, this Chomsky guy seems really interesting. Where should I start? What should I be learning from him? What should I be looking for? How would you respond to that?
Well, obviously the book is my response to that, because I know there are those people. And the fact that I didn't have a good response to those people is why I asked him if I could work with him on a book that would compile. It's not a best of, because it's not previously published writings. It's a new, updated, freshly original book, but it's something that, like, there's the introductory chapter, which is about how the U.S. crafts its mythology of itself and the contrast between the image and the reality. Then it goes through a series of conflicts. It goes through the global south. It goes through Vietnam. It goes through Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, China, Russia. Then there's a chapter on the media. There's a chapter on international law. There's a chapter on the domestic power structure. And then there's a conclusion encouraging people to fight. So that's the kind of structure of it, because I wanted to take people through in that way. Now, other than, pre-order the book, I would say that just start watching his lectures on YouTube. If you look up Chomsky videos on YouTube, I did a cool interview with him. Probably the second interview I did with him was much better than the first. The first I was very nervous and it wasn't very good. The second interview, I figured out what I wanted to ask him, and that's pretty good. But lots of people did interviews with him. I would also say that he's best when he's being challenged. So if Chomsky was being asked like flattering questions by sympathetic audiences, he would just kind of give his canned answers a lot. But when he gets critical questioners, so there's an interview with Andrew Marr on, I think, the BBC. There's like a Canadian conservative who, there's one where David Frum confronts Chomsky, like in the 80s. David Frum's like 25, and he's like, you don't care about the Kurds. And Chomsky's like, I have been helping the Kurds for years. It's great. And if you watch like the William F. Buckley debate, like you see, or Alan Dershowitz, or he debated Richard Pearl, one of the leading neocons. So if you watch Chomsky in these debates where the claws really come out, he gets very, very lively. And also by being challenged, you see his responses to the anticipated criticisms. And that's really helpful, because you can see that the things that people say to support the other side of the argument, he can deal with those things and respond to those things and show why those things are wrong. So I would recommend watching Chomsky engaging with hostile audience questions and hostile debate opponents.
Well, there you all go. Got your marching orders there. Nathan, I mean, I think we'll just have to get you back on sometime soon to talk about Joe Biden and all of that. But really, it's been really wonderful speaking with you and talking about Chomsky. I mean, somebody who has made a huge impact on so many of us on the world, and whose work deserves to be celebrated, read, and distributed as much as possible.
I also have an essay that I wrote back in 2018 called "Lessons from Chomsky," where I just compiled, I think, 12 things that I felt like I had learned from reading his work over the years, with some quotes from him. So people might want to check that out.
Well, before we let you go, talking about checking things out, Current Affairs, excellent magazine. Anything, where can people, get more access to that? Anything exciting coming down the pipeline soon?
Well, currentaffairs.org they should go to, and they can follow us on Twitter at CUR Affairs. Let's see. I mean, the book is the main thing, has been the main project for us recently, but we are continuing to put out wonderful issues of our magazine. We have, and we also have a podcast. So the print edition is our baby. So subscribe to the print edition.
Also subscribe if you got like a sort of pretentious baby uncle or something. Current Affairs is the perfectly named magazine to subscribe them to, and they might not realize what
that's
they're
important.
reading.
Subscribe your enemies to Current Affairs, because you don't just have to subscribe yourself. Subscribe people you dislike to the magazine so that they get it against their will. That's really important. I also wrote a book called Why You Should Be a Socialist, and the purpose of that book is to annoy relatives. It's just a gift book for right-wing relatives, so Why You Should Be a Socialist. Highly recommend that if you want to antagonize someone.
Well, there we go. Nathan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to see you, David. Nice to see you, Matt. All the best.
Nice to see you, Nathan. Thank you.